All right, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 7. We're talking about police corruption and responses, and we're going to talk a little bit now about explanations of deviance. We still have a lot to cover, so hang in there and let's go ahead and dive right in. So, explanations of corruption can be categorized into individual, organizational, and societal based, on identified factors. And these factors then provide kind of an avenue for how to reduce misconduct. So it is important for us to kind of take note at the onset that there is rarely only one factor or group of factors responsible for these types of corruption scandals. And so let's kind of dive into those. So let's talk now first about individual explanations. So the most common explanation of police officer corruption is the kind of rotten apple argument, right? That the officer alone was the bad apple, if you will, and that it was simply a mistake to hire him or her in the first place. And this argument has been kind of extended to describe the rotten bushels, if you will. So groups of officers basically banding together to commit deviant acts. And the point of this argument really is that nothing is wrong with the barrel, right? The whole department. It's basically the individual. It's not endemic. It's not the whole department. It's the person. So kind of some interesting thoughts when it comes to that. The officer became deviant either before hiring or the officer became deviant after hiring is kind of like all of these questions that we should probably ask ourselves. Now, Sherman in 1982 explained that deviant offers go through what he calls kind of a moral career as they pass through various stages of rationalization to more serious misdeeds in a graduated kind of even systemic way, if you will. So they kind of go down this pathway. And once an individual gets past the first moral crisis, it becomes less difficult to rationalize new and more unethical behaviors. So again, it's kind of this slippery slope thing. And while it seems to be true that corrupt officers who come to the attention of authorities engage in a range of minor misconduct to serious behavior, there really is no good evidence to indicate that something like taking gratuities inevitably leads to more serious forms of misconduct. So it's a theory that's brought about by Sherman, but there's no real evidence to show that, hey, that cup of coffee that we talked about earlier led to this police officer becoming a criminal, if you will. And, many police officers have, clear personal guidelines on what is acceptable and, what is not acceptable. Police routinely deal with the kind of, steamier side of society, if you will. Not only drug addicts and muggers, but also, middle-class individuals who are involved in dishonesty and corruption. And the constant displays of lying, hiding, cheating, and theft, and all this other stuff create cynicism, if you will. And this in turn may develop into a vulnerability to temptation because officers may redefine corrupt acts as some type of, acceptable behavior. So it's kind of interesting. Just, understand that cops do see the bad side of everybody. They see some good sides too, but they also really see the bad side. And that constant contact and interaction might start to create that level of cynicism that we've talked about, which then might turn into or develop into a vulnerability for temptation. Now, when we talk about some, explanations as we keep going here, it's been kind of shown that, college-educated officers were less likely to be terminated. Women were more likely than male officers to be terminated during probation. Younger officers, those under 22 years of age when appointed, were more likely to be terminated during probation. So again, just some kind of things to think about when we talk about individual explanations. Black officers, but not other minorities, were more likely to be terminated. Those who had prior negative employment histories, dishonorable discharges, or did poorly in the academy, were more likely to be terminated for misconduct. But then again, remember, as I said earlier, off-duty conduct, many fail probation because of that. Okay, so that is something definitely for us to kind of keep in mind. So as we kind of keep talking about these things, understand that one emerging individual explanation for some types of police misconduct is PTSD. Military veterans may experience some type of symptoms. Officers exposed to trauma may experience these types of symptoms as well. And we're going to talk about some factors that really kind of talk about PTSD and kind of give you at least a little idea of what it might include. So things like witnessing the death of a friend or a partner, accidentally killing or wounding a bystander, failing to stop a suspect, perhaps, right? Maybe killing or wounding a child or a teenager, viewing the body of a child victim, interacting with a grieving family. All of these things are some factors that have been found to develop PTSD. Feeling caught in a violent riot, viewing bloody or gruesome crime scenes, observing an event involving violence or murder, being, undercover and constantly on guard on whether you're going to be exposed or caught or found out, etc., and even being threatened by suspects. So, research has also shown that PTSD symptoms are correlated with family violence and alcohol abuse. And there does need to be more research, but understand that these things can actually form this PTSD factor that we are talking about. So now those were individual, but what about now organizational explanations? So various elements of the organizations can also breed misconduct. If you recall from chapter 4, that organizational factors that affect ethical behavior a lot of times include small groups, right? So that small work group influence, isolated work groups develop their own little microclimates, if you will, that, can be one that does not conform to organizational ethics. And other organizational elements include, different incentives and a culture that does not, emphasize integrity. But, keeping this small work group thing in mind. Small work groups, again, are kind of exemplified by special units like narcotic task forces. And there seems to be a pattern in news stories of these small groups developing, again, these microcultures of unethical behavior, perhaps because of their levels of discretion or lack of supervision or whatever, kind of comes to mind. But these would include things like gang units, narcotics units, even street crime units. So this is kind of one organizational explanation that has come about. We talked about, again, as we mentioned in chapter 4, where, organizational incentives might encourage unethical behavior, or where there's even pressure to achieve a goal without a corresponding message that ethical means are just as important, and organizational actors might be tempted to take shortcuts, meaning the officers are, because of the pressure to solve the case, make the arrest, they might take some shortcuts instead of understanding that, we want to do this within the confines of the law. And then, the organizational culture itself, right? Both formal and informal may create some type of deviance. So, consider, we've got Gil Martin and Harris in 1998, discussed why some officers become compromised and argue that it's because the law enforcement organization does not adequately train them to understand and respond to ethical dilemmas that they're going to encounter, right? And they coined the term continuum of compromise to illustrate what happens to basically an officer. And I'll show you a chart of that. Also consider the noble cause explanation, whereby officers cut corners to get the bad guy because, it's a better cause or outcome for everyone. So as long as we get the bad guy, it's okay. And it doesn't matter that we violated somebody's rights or we did the shortcut or whatever, because here the end justifies the means. So again, still talking organizational explanation. And I mentioned that continuum of compromise is sometimes used to illustrate what happens to the officer. You've got this perceived sense of victimization. Then you've got the loyalty and integrity, the entitlement and accountability, the acts of omission. Okay. Then you've got the administrative acts of commission, meaning that they violate or break small rules. And then finally, they end up into the corruption stage. So that's one example of going from an honest cop to a corrupt cop. Okay. And here's another chart that talks about the dynamics of police integrity, the personal forces affecting police personnel. Okay. Personal forces. And then you have the department forces. And then you have the external forces. So this is all these different dynamics that talk about police integrity and the officer's career, and how do they deal with all of these influences. Again, the personal ones, the department ones, and even the external ones. So what about, finally, of the three? Remember, we're going to talk now about the societal explanations. Murphy and Kaplan in 1989 argue that lax community standards over certain types of behavior and lack of support from prosecutors and courts can lead to corruption. And here, police hear mixed messages from the public regarding certain crimes. We ask police to take care of certain social problems, right? Like homelessness or drug dealers or domestic issues and so on. Even if it means going outside the lines to do it, if it's not going to be used against us. So like, we're okay in society, hey, to take care of all those things that bug us, like homelessness or whatever, go ahead, go arrest them. Deal with the drug addicts. Go do all that stuff. We don't want to hear about it. Oh, and by the way, as long as you don't use it against us, we don't care. So these are some of the societal type explanations. And, if the public doesn't comply with the law, then officers may start to rationalize non-enforcement of it. If the public engages in illegal activities, officers may feel justified in doing the same. Well, hey, they can do it, so what the heck? Why can't I do it? And if the public believes crime control is more important than due process, well, the police might start to act on that message as well. Well, the public doesn't care about due process, so why should I care? So these are, again, this falls under that societal type explanation. So with all of that said now, how do we reduce it? So, comprehensive lists of suggestions to reduce police misconduct and corruption have been proposed. So let's kind of, Some of these are a little bit older. They date back a little bit, but that doesn't mean that that they've been implemented. So here's some on the list. Maybe increase pay. Why do you think that some of these places like In-N-Out pay so well? Well, yeah, the companies make a lot of money, but you know what? They don't have that much employee turnover, and they don't have that much theft because they pay their employees enough. Does that kind of make sense? Eliminate unforeseeable laws. Establish civilian review boards. Improve training. Set some realistic goals, not unrealistic expectations of your officers. Provide ethical leadership. Perform audits to make sure that we know, what's going on with money, of resources and funds, things that are maybe audits on money that's been paid to informants. Have financial disclosure rules. Provide that written code of ethics that your department employees can see and live up to. Have a procedure where people can report ethical misconduct. Improve your internal affairs unit. Rotate staff in certain positions. We talked about narcotics officers, etc., only being allowed to work in that unit for a certain amount of time so they don't get caught up with all the hubbub. Better evidence handling procedures. Have some early warning systems. And this would be through your internal affairs units, where if officers started to get complaints, start monitoring why and what the complaints are for so you can nip it early. Okay, and that's a really important thing to do. Use video cameras in patrol cars, or have body-worn cameras out there. Have your officers wear body-worn cameras. Use high-tech surveillance. Sometimes possibly use some targeted integrity testing. Conduct surveys of police and the public. How do your cops feel? How do the public feel? And then, decriminalize some different types of vice crimes. And again, some of these are old, but we want to make sure that we kind of talked about all of them on the list. So with that being said, note that most of these suggestions target administrative changes than, identifying the individual officer as a problem. And in more recent years, body cameras requiring police to carry their own insurance, maybe even docking pensions for misconduct, and other suggestions have been offered to reduce the costs of misconduct. So now let's kind of look at some of those. Remember, we talked about rotten apple. Well, let's look at some responses to that. So how do we really talk about that, and how do we reduce, or what's the response to the rotten apple? So, rotten apple approaches to reduce misconduct focus on the individual officer. And there is an assumption that if an officer or officers are found to be deviant, basically the wrong person was hired, or there needs to be better training or better monitoring, discipline, etc. So improving screenings like background checks or interviews or credit checks, polygraphs, drug tests. These are ways to deal with the rotten apple response. Hey, it's not the department, it's the individual that we hired. The most common pre-employment screening tool is called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multi-Phasic Personality Inventory Test. The so-called Big Five: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Conscientiousness seems to be the most relevant when it comes to job performance, etc. So again, these are all things to improve, right? Education and training. The International Association of Chiefs of Police back in 2008 found that about 80% of responding agencies said they committed resources to ethics instructions, although most courses simply employed lectures and were about 4 hours or less. So the major recommendation from IACP based on this study were to provide job-specific training on ethics and to differentiate training for recruits in service, management, as well as other units. And another recommendation was that ethics training begin with the recruits, right? And be an integral part of the department structure and policies. So, higher formal education standards are not themselves the key to ethical behavior, but it's important. Academy and in-service ethics training are common and recommended for all departments. Many courses use a moral reasoning approach, and some advocate an emphasis on character, and using, different case studies, etc. So we've talked about the importance of education and training. Maybe even some integrity testing. This is super controversial, but this occurs when a police officer is placed in a position where he or she might be tempted to break a rule or break a law and monitored to actually see what they do. And it sounds kind of deviant, if you will, but that could be one aspect of testing, right? Again, it's not well received by most officers. Comparing integrity testing to undercover operations reveals typically that most officers oppose integrity testing, but most officers support undercover operations. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic. Again, looking at early warning systems, look at the number of complaints, use of force reports, use of weapon reports, reprimands, or other indicators to identify officers. And we had this in the department that I came from. There was an early warning system, and when an officer reached each thing was a certain amount of points. So a complaint was a certain amount of points, use of force was a certain amount, weapons was a certain amount, reprimands, etc. And when you reached a certain plateau of points, it would basically kind of activate the early warning flag, and you could sit with a particular officer and try to figure out how to fix the path that they're on. Why do they have so many things going on? And that was really important. But that intervention could include, more supervision, maybe more training, some counseling, reassignment, referral to employee assistance, or at its very, nth degree, if you will, it could be grounds for termination. But this system actually, I thought, was very, very, it was good. It worked. Body cameras. We talk about that a little bit. Police departments have increasingly purchased and equipped their officers with body cameras, and there are many positives and some negatives that come with body cameras. And of course, there's a policy that goes along with any of those types of things. Video has become an incredibly powerful tool to support allegations of force and to also refute those false complaints that officers tend to get. Officers are now beginning to use cameras too. All the time. They are increasingly supportive of body cameras, as studies have shown that citizens' behavior improves when they know that they're being filmed, and the footage helped to defend the officer's actions. Even before body cameras came out, a lot of officers that I know, including myself when I was an officer, I would carry a tape recorder on my belt. Now, you wouldn't get the video, but you would get the audio. Same concept, right, as having a camera to protect myself against a false complaint. So, there are, however, critics of body cameras. Powerful tool to support citizens who allege brutality. Officers can turn the camera off when they want. Well, that's why you have a policy. And if they violate the policy, they're disciplined for that. Now, the biggest thing would be the cost of the cameras and storing the, unimaginable amount of video do make, this use of cameras a lot of times not that simple, okay? And there needs to be a way to pay for things like that. There could be some invasion of privacy issues. And then, of course, rules regarding whether, and when police officers should turn off the camera. those are things that are being worked out, and those are things that are done through a policy. In my organization, when we implemented body cameras, and remember, Rialto was the first department in the United States to do an actual randomized control study with University of Cambridge in England. And when we basically built the policy, I sat down with our police union and they helped me write the policy. So that way they knew exactly what they were getting into. So that was a really good way of doing that. And here is kind of a picture of a slide of the actual study that we did. And just to kind of give you some examples of how good it worked, you can see here that the baseline year we had 24 complaints as we're kind of looking at it. And then when we did the experiment, we dropped down. You can see we dropped down to 3. A year after we were at 4, and a year after we stayed at 4. So these cameras actually worked. And here's a little, we talk about complaints. You can look at the difference in the colors here, and you can see exactly how these mapped out. The same with uses of force. Before we did the experiment, there were 61 in that year. During the experiment, it dropped to 25. A year after, it went to 33. A year after that, it was 34. So still a significant decrease, right, in uses of force. And you can see how it mapped out here. So body cameras are a great tool. Well, what about a public database? So as a result of many people not trusting police departments to root out individuals who should not be in policing and have the power and authority inherent in that position, individuals and groups have constructed databases of wrongful actions, and police argue instances of serious wrongdoing are rare, and that problem officers who have a pattern of wrongdoing are rarer still. Such efforts are designed to bring to light, to the subject of police misconduct. Because there have been times where an officer may have been terminated from one agency for something not good and got hired somehow at another agency. So that's the rationale behind a public database. So that's just kind of a little bit of behind the scenes information. We talked about the internal affairs model, right? Civil service and arbitration. So a review procedure in which investigators receive and investigate complaints and resolve the investigations internally. So making sure that your internal affairs bureau reports directly to the chief of police and that they are proactive in what they do through the organization, including audits and other things like that, and making sure that they investigate impropriety. The possibility of a civilian review board. This is an outside agency or board that includes citizens and monitors and or investigates misconduct complaints against police. And, the Los Angeles Police Commission is one of the larger ones here in the state of California. Maybe even changing the culture in an organization. That's a really big thing too, but that's another way to deal with, ensuring that you're getting rid of that rotten barrel, if you will. It could be ethical leadership. As discussed in Chapter 4, improving leadership is an essential element in improving the ethical climate of any organization. So that's really important. Societal responses. It is difficult to conceive of how society can affect police corruption. However, it is possible that this is the most important part of the discussion, as noted repeatedly within several chapters that we've already talked about. We have seen a new era of scrutiny regarding what is occurring in American policing. And communities can promote clear expectations regarding what type of policing they're willing to accept through legal means, and federal intervention could be necessary. So there is a saying that a community gets the governments they deserve, and it may also be said that a community gets the policing that they demand. Consent decrees. Civil rights cases against police officers are rare, but one avenue that involves more kind of systemic change is the use of, basically consent decrees. Several organizations, typically these larger organizations, and LAPD was one of them, where basically, consent decrees, they mandate certain reforms approved by a federal judge with a court-appointed monitor to kind of oversee the program. And that order might include changes in policies and procedure. It may require hiring more officers or increasing training. The most common target for change usually involves, policing concerning the use of force, citizen complaint procedures, video, racial profiling, data collection, early warning systems, and training. So consent decrees, while they are not good, of course, they can bring about change, and they have in several other organizations. And then there are some other societal responses. So finally, we talked a little bit about consent decrees. So we kind of already went over that. So we can kind of go through that. All right, so we actually a little bit quicker than I thought. I hope that was very informative and that we didn't go, too quickly, but I think we were able to fit everything in. So with that being said, that will conclude part 2 of chapter 7, Police Corruption and Responses.